The chair screeched across the concrete patio, hurled by a leather-clad arm toward the old man in the wheelchair. Time seemed to slow as cafe patrons watched in horror. Their morning coffees had gotten in their hands. The German shepherd, Max, moved like liquid lightning, positioning his muscular body between the flying furniture and the paralyzed man, his teeth bared in a silent warning that made even grown men step back. The biker, Jake, stood with his feet planted wide, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes that held something darker, something broken. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent patio. "It's just a joke." But as Max's growl rumbled like distant thunder, no one was laughing. And no one, least of all Jake, realized that in that moment, 3 lives connected by tragedy were about to collide in ways that would change them forever. The service vest on Max's back told a story Jake couldn't yet read, and the old man's clear blue eyes held no fear, only a puzzling recognition, as if he'd been waiting for Jake all along. Frank Thompson had once been a whirlwind of energy, the kind of man who'd never walk when he could run, never speak when he could shout. That was before the rainy Tuesday evening when a drunk driver swerved across the center line on Highway 12, taking his partner's life and his ability to walk in one catastrophic moment. At 65 years old, Frank now navigated the world from a wheelchair, his hands calloused from pushing the wheels. His gray hair, often tousled by the wind, gave him a rugged, weathered look. What Frank had lost in mobility, he gained in perspective. The nurses at Cedar Ridge Memorial often whispered that he had old eyes, too knowing, too accepting for a man who'd suffered such profound loss. Still, flashes of his old self would break through when Max, his German shepherd service dog, was nearby. Max had been Frank's last gift to himself, arranged before his retirement through connections at the K-9 unit, where Frank had served as a police officer. Frank's background made him uniquely qualified for his role in Max's life. Before becoming his service dog, Max had served 3 distinguished years in the Cedar Ridge Police Department's K-9 unit, specializing in search and rescue operations. His training had been so exemplary that he'd received special commendation when he located 2 children trapped beneath rubble after a gas explosion. Max's transition to service work had been seamless, trading the intensity of police work for the constant vigilance required to assist Frank. The specialized harness he wore allowed Frank to steady himself during transfers, while his imposing presence deterred the unwanted attention a wheelchair sometimes attracted. Max was more than Frank's assistant. He was his guardian confidant and bridge to independence. Jake Carter hadn't always been the kind of man who'd intimidate an old cop. Before his 3 tours in Iraq, he'd been known for his easy laugh and steady hands that had trained military dogs with a patience few handlers possessed. But war had hollowed him out, replacing calm confidence with jagged anxiety and unpredictable rage. The memories haunted him. The explosion, the frantic barking of his K-9 partner trying to alert him, the sacrifice of his best friend Mike, who'd pushed him clear of the blast. Jake's return to civilian life had been a series of failures. Jobs lost to sudden angry outbursts, relationships fractured by his nightmares, self-medication with whatever would quiet his mind. The leather jacket and motorcycle had become his armor against a world that no longer made sense, the rumble of the engine drowning out the persistent ringing in his ears. The morning had dawned picture-perfect over Cedar Ridge, with a kind of clear blue sky that seemed to promise nothing but good things. At Maplewood Cafe, the outdoor patio had filled early with the usual mix of professionals grabbing coffee before work, retirees lingering over breakfast, and locals who treated the cafe as their second office. The corner table, slightly removed from the busiest section, had become something of an unofficial reservation for Frank and his sister, Helen. The staff had grown accustomed to the old man's wheelchair needing extra space, and the manager, Linda, always made sure the table was available for their Tuesday morning visits. Frank sat with his back straight in his wheelchair, his legs covered with a light blanket, despite the warmth of the day, a concession to circulation issues that Helen insisted upon. Max lay in a perfect downstay position beside him, his alert eyes continuously scanning the patio with professional vigilance. On the table sat Frank's black coffee, Helen's tea, and a shared plate of blueberry muffins that Frank methodically broke into bite-sized pieces. "Remember your exercises this afternoon," Helen was saying. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the day's schedule in her worn planner. Dr. Wilson says you're making excellent progress with your upper body strength. Frank nodded, though his attention had drifted to a monarch butterfly landing briefly on a nearby flowering bush. Helen, do butterflies remember being caterpillars? He asked, his question reflecting the characteristic way his mind wandered between practical matters and philosophical musings. Helen smiled, accustomed to these sudden shifts. That's a good question for your science teacher, Frank. She checked her watch and frowned slightly. I need to stop by the pharmacy before your appointment. Your new medication came in yesterday. Frank's face fell slightly. The new medication was supposed to help with the pain that sometimes shot through his legs, phantom sensations from nerves that refused to accept they no longer commanded movement. Can't we skip it today? I don't like how it makes my head fuzzy. We'll talk to Dr. Wilson about adjusting the dose, Helen promised, gathering her purse. I'll be back in 15 minutes. 20 at most. Linda knows I'm stepping out, and Max is right here. She hesitated, her caregiver's instinct warring with the knowledge that Frank needed moments of independence. You'll be okay? Frank nodded solemnly. Max and I will be fine. We'll practice our waiting skills. He patted the dog's head, and his tail thumped once against the concrete in acknowledgement. Helen leaned down to kiss Frank's forehead, her hand automatically checking that the medical alert button was secure around his neck. I'll be quick as lightning. As Helen's sensible shoes clicked away across the patio, Frank turned his attention to his coffee, using both hands to steady the mug as he'd been taught in occupational therapy. Max remained vigilant beside him, his body relaxed but ready. Several patrons nodded or smiled at Frank. He had become something of a fixture at the cafe, his quiet dignity and occasional bright laughter a reminder of resilience that many found inspiring. The peaceful morning rhythm continued for another 10 minutes. Frank had just opened his favorite book, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that belonged to his late wife, when a distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines disrupted the cafe's ambient chatter. 3 bikes pulled up to the curb just beyond the patio's decorative iron fence, their engines cutting off in quick succession. The riders dismounted with the practiced ease of men who lived on their machines. The leader, taller than the others and broad to the shoulders, removed his helmet to reveal close-cropped hair with premature gray at the temples. The leather vest he wore over a faded T-shirt bore no motorcycle club insignia, but the military boots and the way he surveyed his surroundings spoke of someone accustomed to assessing threats. Max's ears pricked forward, his body tensing slightly, though he maintained his downstay. Frank noticed the change immediately. He and Max had developed a kind of wordless communication that comes from constant companionship. "It's okay, boy," Frank whispered, though something in the air had changed, a tension that even his experienced mind could perceive. The 3 men entered the patio area, the leader walking slightly ahead with a rolling gait. A server approached them with menus, but the leader, Jake, waved her off with a brusque, "Just coffee. Black." His voice carried across the patio, slightly too loud, as if he'd forgotten how to modulate it for civilian spaces. As the men settled at a table near the entrance, their presence seemed to expand beyond their physical space. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, more guarded. Jake's restless gaze swept across the patio, briefly settling on Frank and Max before moving on. But seconds later, his eyes snapped back, focusing more intently on the German shepherd. "That's a nice-looking dog," he commented to his companions, though his voice projected enough for Frank to hear. The youngest of the 3 men, who'd introduced himself to the server as Tom, shrugged. "Just some old guy's pet." Jake's laugh held an edge. "That's no pet. Look at how he's positioned, how he's watching everything." He tapped his fingers on the table in a staccato rhythm. "I'd bet money on it." Frank, overhearing this, felt a small flush of pride. People often complimented Max, but few recognized the extent of his training. He glanced at the cafe entrance, hoping to see Helen returning, but the doorway remained empty. The server delivered 3 mugs of coffee to the men's table. As she walked away, Jake rose suddenly, causing Max to shift to high alert, though the dog remained in position. "I'm going to check out that dog," Jake announced, ignoring the way his friends rolled their eyes. "Leave it, Jake," The third man, Sam, said, "Just drink your coffee." But Jake was already moving across the patio with deliberate steps. Several patrons watched warily, unsure of his intentions. As he approached Frank's table, Max's body tensed further, though no sound came from him. Frank looked up at the tall man now standing beside his table, his weathered face composed despite the flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Good morning, sir," he said politely, as Helen had taught him to address strangers. Jake seemed momentarily taken aback by his formality. "Morning, old-timer." His eyes remained on Max. "That's some dog you got there. German shepherd. Purebred from the look of him." "Yes, sir," Frank replied, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Max's head, both for his comfort and as a steadying command to the dog. "His name is Max." "Max, huh?" Jake squatted down the dog's eye level, a move that made Max's ears flatten slightly. "You're a working dog, aren't you, boy?" He reached out a hand toward Max's snout. "Please don't touch him without asking," Frank said quickly. "He's on duty." Jake's hand paused in midair. "On duty?" His eyes took in the service vest he'd somehow missed before, then traveled to Frank's wheelchair. Understanding dawned slowly on his face. "Oh, right." But instead of withdrawing, he left his hand extended inches from Max's nose. "I've handled dogs like him before. They know me." From across the patio, one of Jake's friends called out, "Come on, man. Leave the old guy alone." But Jake seemed transfixed by Max, by the dog's controlled alertness and the intelligent assessment in his eyes. Something about the animal had triggered a cascade of memories, of desert sand and night patrols, of the comforting weight of a K-9 partner against his side in the darkness. "Ex-military?" Jake asked, though it wasn't really a question. Frank shook his head. "Police. He worked with my partner." At the word partner, a shadow crossed Jake's face, a tightening around his eyes that Frank couldn't interpret. The cafe had grown unusually quiet, the other patrons sensing the strange tension building between the man, the old cop, and the dog that watched him with unwavering attention. Max remained perfectly still, but Frank could feel the coiled readiness in his body, the slight tremor of restraint beneath his hand. He glanced again toward the cafe entrance, hoping for Helen's return. The big clock on the cafe wall showed that 12 minutes had passed. Not long in adult time, but an eternity in the stretched moment of an uncomfortable encounter. "Your partner a cop, then?" Jake asked, his voice rougher. "He was." Frank said simply, the past tense heavy with meaning. Something flickered in Jake's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of memory. He straightened up suddenly, looming over the table. "Good dog you've got," he repeated, though the word seemed automatic now. He took a step back, then another, before turning abruptly to rejoin his friends. As he walked away, Frank released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Max remained vigilant, his eyes tracking Jake's movement across the patio. The normal murmur of cafe conversation slowly resumed, though several patrons continued to cast concerned glances toward Frank's table. But the encounter wasn't over. As Jake settled back with his friends, their conversation grew animated, punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed too loud, too forced. Frank tried to return to his book, but found himself reading the same sentence repeatedly, his attention divided between the page and the uncomfortable awareness of being watched. Max knew it too. His body remained tense, his attention fixed on the three men whose presence had disrupted the peaceful morning routine. And somehow Frank sensed, with a cop's intuition, that the seemingly casual encounter had been merely the opening move in a confrontation yet to fully unfold. Jake returned to his friends with a strange expression, something between intrigue and discomfort etched across his weathered features. He took a long swig of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "That dog's got police training," he muttered, loud enough for his companions to hear, but keeping his voice low enough to avoid carrying across the patio. "Not just any service dog." Tom, the youngest of the three, glanced over at Frank's table. "So what? You're going to start a fan club?" His attempt at humor fell flat, as Jake's expression darkened. "I worked with dogs like that," Jake said, his fingers drumming against the table in that persistent rhythm that always appeared when his thoughts turned toward his time in service. "Belgian Malinois in Iraq, but same training principles." That dog's watching me like he knows something. Sam, the third man, shook his head. It's just a dog, Jake. And you're making the old guy uncomfortable. Let it go. But Jake couldn't let it go. Something about the German Shepherd had triggered a flood of memories. The disciplined, alert posture, the intelligent assessment in the animal's eyes. Those eyes had followed him across the patio, watchful in a way that reminded him too much of Rex, his K-9 partner, who'd saved his unit twice before the IED that no dog could have detected in time. Jake rose again, ignoring Sam's muttered curse. I'm just going to see what he does. He moved with deliberate steps back toward Frank's table, aware that several patrons were watching him with undisguised concern. The weight of their gazes prickled along his skin, triggering the hypervigilance that never fully subsided. Max's reaction was immediate, but controlled. The dog shifted position, rising into a perfect sit beside Frank's wheelchair, his body now squarely between the approaching man and the old cop. No growl, no bark, just a precise, professional repositioning that spoke volumes about his training. See that? Jake said loudly enough that his friends could hear. That's defensive positioning. Perfect execution. He stopped about 5 feet from the table, respecting the invisible boundary that Max had established. Your dog ever been deployed overseas, old-timer? Jake asked, his tone taking on a challenging edge. Frank shook his head, his small fingers now resting lightly on Max's shoulder. No, sir. Max worked for the Cedar Ridge Police Department in search and rescue. Jake cocked his head, studying Max with an intensity that made several nearby patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Search and rescue, huh? Found any good missing persons lately? He's retired now, Frank replied, except for helping me. He gestured toward his wheelchair, a simple movement that carried the weight of explanation. Jake's eyes lingered on the wheelchair, then moved back to Max. Let's see how good his training really is. Without warning, he clapped his hands sharply, the sound cracking across the patio like a gunshot. Coffee cups rattled as startled patrons jumped. A woman at the next table gasped audibly. But Max didn't flinch, didn't bark. His ears flattened momentarily, his muscles tense, but he remained in perfect position, his eyes locked on Jake with unwavering focus. Jake, enough? Sam called from their table, half rising from his chair. Leave the old guy and his dog alone. But Jake had found a target for the restless energy that constantly churned inside him, the need to provoke a reaction, to test boundaries until they broke. Good boy, he said to Max, his voice holding a mocking edge. Real steady. But what happens if I do this? He took a sudden step toward Frank. Max's response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated from deep in his chest. A warning as clear as spoken language. The dog didn't move from his position, didn't show teeth, but the message was unmistakable. Stop it, Frank said, his voice smaller now but still composed. You're scaring everyone. Jake glanced around, suddenly aware of the tension that had spread across the patio. Several patrons had pulled out their phones, some openly filming, others with fingers poised over emergency contacts. The server who brought their coffee stood frozen near the entrance, looking uncertainly toward the manager's office. For a moment, something like shame flickered across Jake's face. He took a step back, raising his hand slightly. Just testing his training, he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. No harm meant. Max is very well trained, Frank said, his hand still resting on the dog's shoulder. My partner made sure of that before he went to heaven. His composure wavered slightly on the last words, a man's grief momentarily visible beneath his carefully maintained poise. Jake's expression shifted at the mention of Frank's partner. A muscle twitched in his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. Your partner taught him well, he said, his voice rougher. He turned abruptly, stalking back to his companions with rigid shoulders. Happy now? Sam asked as Jake dropped heavily into his chair. You just harassed a disabled old man. Real heroic, Jake. Tom laughed nervously. The dog didn't even flinch. Military grade for sure. Jake's gaze remained fixed on Frank and Max, something troubled and distant in his eyes. That old guy said his partner's dead. Sam shrugged. Lots of cops die in the line of duty. Doesn't make it your business. Something about them, Jake trailed off, his thoughts whirling in directions he couldn't fully articulate. The coffee in his mug had grown cold, but he drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. The ringing in his ears had intensified, a constant companion since the explosion, but worse now with the adrenaline coursing through his system. Across the patio, Frank had returned to his book, or at least was making a show of reading it. Max remained vigilant, his attention divided between his charge and the three men whose presence had disrupted their morning routine. The turning point. As the days passed, Jake couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. The image of Frank's calm demeanor, the way Max had protected him without hesitation, haunted him. It reminded him of the loyalty and purpose he'd once known, before the war, before the anger and the guilt had consumed him. One evening, Jake found himself standing outside the Cedar Ridge Police Department, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He took a deep breath and walked inside, approaching the front desk. "I need to speak with someone," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "About an incident at the Maplewood Cafe, and about Frank Thompson." The officer behind the desk nodded, recognizing the name. "Wait here. I'll get Captain Harris." Weeks later, Frank sat on the patio of the Maplewood Cafe, Max by his side as always. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the scene, and the usual patrons greeted Frank with smiles and nods. But something was different today. Jake walked into the cafe, his demeanor transformed. Gone was the leather jacket and the aggressive stance. In its place was a man who had found a measure of peace. "Frank," Jake said, approaching the table. "Can I join you?" Frank looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Sure, Jake. Have a seat." Jake sat down, his hands clasped on the table. "I owe you an apology for how I acted that day, and for a lot of things." Frank nodded, his eyes kind. "We all carry burdens, Jake. The important thing is what we do with them." Jake took a deep breath. "I've been getting help. Therapy, support groups. It's not easy, but I'm trying, and I want to make amends. Not just to you, but to myself." Frank smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "That's all anyone can ask for. To try." Max, sensing the shift in Jake's energy, thumped his tail against the ground. Jake reached out slowly, letting Max sniff his hand before gently petting him. "He's a good dog," Jake said softly. "The best." "He is," Frank agreed. "And he's taught me more about loyalty and resilience than I ever thought possible." The moral lesson. As the two men sat there, sharing stories and finding common ground, the cafe buzzed with life around them. The lesson was clear. No matter how broken we may feel, there is always a path to healing. It takes courage to face our past, to apologize for our mistakes, and to seek forgiveness, not just from others, but from ourselves. Frank and Jake's unlikely friendship became a testament to the power of second chances. Max, the loyal guardian, had not only protected Frank, but had also bridged the gap between two men who had both been shaped by loss and trauma. In the end, it's not the scars we carry that define us, but how we choose to move forward. Whether it's the unwavering loyalty of a service dog, the quiet strength of an old cop, or the hard-earned redemption of a biker, we all have a capacity to heal, to grow, and to find connection in the most unexpected places. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, Frank, Jake, and Max sat together, a symbol of resilience and hope. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there is light to be found. And sometimes that light comes in the form of a loyal dog, a kind word, or the courage to say, "I'm sorry." So, as you go through life, remember, it's never too late to change, to forgive, or to start anew. Because in the end, it's not about where we've been, but where we're going, and who we choose to take with us on the journey.